So the first thing I started off doing is to cut these pieces of cab strip. These are roughly an inch and a half long, I believe. And this is the center rib of the center section, and these pieces are just glued in place on the insides of the existing cab strips all the way up against what would be the area where the aileron would attach if this were a wing rib. And I did the same thing on the end ribs. I just cut the pieces of cap strip and I fit them in the aftmost vertical piece of the ribs and just epoxied them on the inside. And of course I do this with the other rib as well. So you'll have two of these on each rib, top and bottom, on the insides of the cap strips. Then next I take another piece of cap strip and I lay it on top of those pieces that were just shown. So after those have been put in place and the epoxy has dried, these longer pieces then get epoxied on top. So now the tops of these long pieces are on the same plane as the tops of the rib cap strips themselves. And of course you do this on the top and the bottom, so you'll need 4 individual pieces to string across from one rib to the next on top of the little anchor pieces that were glued in. And here you can see kind of where the location is. It's that last vertical piece of cap strip that these get epoxied behind. There's a lot going on in this picture, so I'm going to stay here for a little while and try to explain this the best that I can. I wanted to add a handhold to the center section as part of the cutout area, so I need to make some kind of a well for the handhold to fit into. Now of course the handhold is custom made, so it could be any size or shape that you want. And the way that I got started with that was to make this cutout in the center rib. Now you can see running from the foreground to the background the newly added lengths of cap strip that run from one rib to the next. Just forward of that is the vertical piece of cap strip that was one of the original pieces of the center rib that these newly added pieces of cap strip attached to. Now the piece of the center rib between that vertical piece and the forward vertical piece, that has been cut out. Just that top section of cap strip on the center rib has been removed so that I can fit this handhold down into it. Since that section has been removed, that forward vertical piece needs to be in place to support the end of the top cap strip since you've cut out the rest of its length. The heavier piece of cap strip, which is roughly half inch square in this picture, that heavy piece is clamped to the existing cap strip so that I can maintain the correct height of that top cap strip even after I had cut out the section for the handhold. So with that heavy piece clamped in place, I know exactly how long to make that forwardmost vertical piece of cap strip to hold that loose end of the top cap strip on the same plane height-wise as the rest of the rib and the other ribs, so that when you skin when you put the plywood skin on for the cutout and you put your fabric on, this center rib area won't be sunken in or sticking out. It will still maintain that same plane. Sorry. So the only thing that I have done in this picture is cut out that length of cap strip on the top, and then I reinforced the forwardmost edge of that with a vertical piece. Now that diagonal piece of cap strip, you'll notice a wider piece of plywood. That the and I'll get into this in a moment, but I used balsa wood to make my handhold, and it came out just a little undersized, so I needed to shim the bottom of it, which is why that piece of plywood is there. And I also made the plywood a little bit wider than the cap strip because I wanted a little bit more of a stable base for the handhold to fit into. And then of course, since I added that plywood, I had to notch that lower gusset a little bit on both sides to get that plywood to nestle in there. So let me go over it one more time real quick. The heavy 1/2 inch piece across the top is just to help me maintain that top cap strip angle, which dictates the vertical piece of cap strip to the forward part of that cutout, so that it will support that end of the cap strip and maintain that plane on top. And then the piece of plywood that you see underneath is nothing more than a shim. Alright, hopefully that somewhat makes sense. I'm sure if you look at it and think about it, you'll make some sense of it. But let me move on and get some other pictures in here, and hopefully that will clear things up a little bit more for you. Hopefully. So here's the handhold that I made. It's made out of balsa wood. I didn't have a chunk of balsa handy that was big enough for this handhold, so I had to laminate a couple pieces together using some epoxy to get the thickness that I needed. But this is how it ended up looking. The angles that you see it cut at, it had to be cut in that fashion to fit into the cutout area of the rib that I had just talked about. And basically what I had done to get that to fit was I took some thin cardboard and laid it against the side of the center rib, and I just traced out the cutout with a pencil right onto the cardboard. And then I used that as a template to lay out the angles to cut this piece so that it would fit down into that center section cutout that I just talked about. So the hole, the actual handhold itself, I just did that with you know, like a utility knife and some chisels, and basically cut that out by hand. I laid it out with a pencil, and then I just went ahead and started removing material with knives and forks and spoons and whatever I can get the balsa wood out with. You'll notice the bottom of the handhold is not entirely flat. Half of it is flat toward the right hand side, and you'll see the left side of the bottom is kind of angled. It's just something I wanted to do. I think it feels a little bit better when you stick your fingers down in there, but just a little detail. And then I lathered that pretty well with T88 on the inside because it's the balsa is so soft and porous. I just wanted to get something down in there to firm it up and to seal it up. So I lathered it pretty heavily all on the inside with some T88. Now that you've got your handhold made and you're happy with the size and the shape, and you've dry fit it to make sure it fits down into that center rib pocket nice, you can go ahead and epoxy that in place. You'll notice the pieces of cap strip that I've got clamped on top of it. That is just to make sure that the top of the handhold is even and flush with the top of the rib cap strips. The two smaller pieces of cap strip that are clamped on the ends of the handhold, those are there just to keep it from tilting left or right. It just keeps it nice and flat and even. And then the heavier center piece of cap strip that's clamped in the middle there with the weight on the end, that's just to make sure that everything is on the same plane and it's nice and flat with nothing sticking out or nothing sagging, so to speak. Here you can see with everything removed that the handhold is in place. And again, I would just want to point out that the top of the handhold is nice and flat and even and on the same plane as the cap strips that make up the center section on the top. You'll notice that that forward vertical piece of cap strip now has gussets on both sides, top and bottom. And let's see, what else can you make from this picture? Oh, as you see in this picture, at this point the center or the handhold is only epoxied to those couple of pieces of cap strip in the center. There's nothing else holding that in place at this moment anyway, other than the half-inch pieces of cap strip that it's epoxied to on both sides and across the bottom. Here's another shot of the bottom. This is a little bit later in the work stage, because you can see I've got plywood in place, but if you can ignore the plywood for the moment, again, this is the bottom, and you can see that plywood spacer that I had to fit on the bottom between the center rib cap strip and the handhold itself. You can see that the added vertical piece that butts up against the side of the handhold has the gussets, as I had pointed out before. That's gusseted in place, and it fits in there pretty snug. Like I said, it's just balsa wood, so you've got some room there to wiggle. And then this is just a little bit broader shot of it in place with the various pieces of cap strip that I've been talking about that tie the ribs together from one to the other to the other. So this is where we're at so far, and so far so good. Ha. A little trick that I had learned in school some years ago: to make a curve, you can lay out your length and width of the curve that you want. In this case, this is the cutout area for the center section, obviously. So I had an idea how long to make it and how wide it needed to be. And then you lay out hash marks along both of those lines, and I think these are half-inch hash marks on both the length and the width. And then the tedious part is connecting those hash marks from the line on one side to the line on the other. So after you have your length and width laid out and your hash marks laid out, you basically connect the dots from the first hash on the one line to the first hash of the other line. And then you just continue to connect those lines, and it will automatically give you this nice, gentle, flowing curve. And then you'll see here the finished product. Now, what you'll notice about this particular template is there's no provisions for the handhold. So this template is not the actual template that I used, but this is the method that I used to get the curve. So I just added a little extra meat to the cardboard to include the handhold. But this hash marked, I don't know what you want to call it. I don't know if you want to call it a grid or what, but it's a relatively easy way to lay out some nice gentle curves, and I thought it worked just fine, and it gave me the exact shape that I wanted for my cutout. This is the cardboard template in place. One thing that you may notice is that it stops short of the trailing edge. At the time, I wasn't sure how I was going to make the interface between the center section and the wings on the trailing edge. So I decided just to cut the template a little short and make the plywood a little short so that I can make the interface between this and the wings when I get the wings assembled to the center section. Here is the actual plywood piece in place. Again, it is cut short on the trailing edge so that I can custom fit the trailing edge pieces to the wing when I get the wing assembled. And you also notice that the plywood lays over top of the handhold block. The only cutout is for the circular area where the fingers go into. This section, this picture here, is of the top piece of plywood viewed from the bottom, and again you can see how it overlays the handhold block, and it adds a tremendous amount of strength. Initially the block was just epoxied to the cap strips around the center of it, but now when you start adding the plywood, the plywood starts to add a lot of strength to it. And then this picture is just again the little weights that I use to hold everything down. A little bit of clamping pressure, just because the larger sections of plywood like this, they tend to bend and warp a little bit, so I just use these weights to help hold it in place. This is actually the bottom of the center section. This is the bottom plywood cutout. It's basically a duplicate of the top piece without the cutout, obviously. If I remember correctly, I did have to modify it, the template. I had to modify the template just ever so slightly for this bottom one, because of the top plywood piece is actually at an angle to this piece, and I'm not really sure, but I think I did have to change the template ever so slightly on this bottom piece to get this piece and the matching top piece to fit correctly to each other. And then this is nothing more than the final result after the epoxy has dried. So now I've got my top and bottom plywood pieces sandwiching between them the handhold block. And again, as you continue to build this up, it adds more and more strength to that handhold. And then finally, creeping up here slowly, is just another angle of the same thing. This is a bottom view as well as the finished plywood for the handhold. So again, as I said, as you continue to build it, it gets stronger and stronger, and we'll continue on with some more cutout details. The next thing I did then, after I got my cutout plywood in place initially, was to install these lengths of plywood. I believe they're 2 inches wide. I'm not sure. They may be 1.5 inches. I don't remember, but they just get epoxied on top of the end rib cap strips, front to back. And of course, as you see, I use my little weights again to help hold them down, because they are long and skinny. They may tend to fight you a little bit when you try to curve them around the cap strip. So you'll need something to clamp them or to hold them in place while the epoxy dries. It's pretty straightforward. It's just strips of plywood. There's really not a whole lot else to say about them. It was at this stage in the center section build that I had stopped and shelved it for a couple of years. I wasn't sure how to finish off the cutout area, and I wasn't sure exactly how my metal fittings were going to be shaped and formed and fitted for the wing attaching points and the cabane strut points. So there were a few areas that I wasn't really sure how I was going to do yet at this point, and of course the fittings, the metal fittings, need to be in place so that I can put the bottom on the center section and that kind of stuff. I just wasn't comfortable proceeding because I didn't feel like I had enough of the rest of the plane built to fit anything. I didn't have the fuselage built at this time, so I couldn't fit the cabanes to anything, etc., etc. So from this point on in the video, there's been a gap of a couple of years, so some things may get covered twice, and some of the video clips that are coming up may seem a little outdated for the time frame that they're used here in this video, but hopefully it will all come together in the end.
Hey everybody, just wanted to say real quick again, thanks for checking out my YouTube videos, and just a couple of real quick tidbits before you leave. If you'd be so kind as to check out my GoFundMe page, the link is down in the description of these videos. For those of you who find it in your heart to donate for this new cause of mine, I've got another project going on, And there's some really cool things I'd like to do with this aircraft. And again, that's all explained in my GoFundMe. But if you find moved enough to go do that and donate, I've got this horizontal stabilizer skin, and donors will get their name put on this skin, and ultimately when this gets filled and the aircraft gets finished, this is going to be hung up on the wall of honor in my hangar. Just a little bit of recognition for those donors who helped make the project a reality. Another thing too is, I'm sure you've noticed that even this video that I'm making right now is of the same or worse quality than the video that you just watched, and that's because, believe it or not, this camera is the exact same camera that I filmed the original hint videos with. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not really sure why, but I know the video quality lacks, but hopefully the information within is worth something. And the other thing that I want to mention real quick is, again, these are little snippets from my hint video DVDs, so a lot of these individual clips just kind of come to an abrupt end. That's just the way it is when I'm trying to rip these DVDs apart and re-edit them into small little segments, and they just kind of end weird at times. But that's it. That's all I wanted to say. And again, thanks, and I hope you'll come back, check out my channel, and see if there are any new videos and updates. All right, I'll talk to you then. See you.